Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Boudry.
And I'm Ryan Cummings.
Welcome to Your Bread and Butter Podcast.
Today is episode 41. Wait, they want to spend what on what?
Federal policy coming up, part 2.
Stay tuned.
Discussions in this show should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult with your investment professional before making important investment decisions. Securities offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a registered broker-dealer. Member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors Incorporated, a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Private Financial Design LLC are not affiliated.
Bread and butter.
Hey, everybody. Glad you're here. We're looking at part 2 for Wait. How are they spending our money this year? Federal policy spending.
I think a lot of people have that question when it comes to the government, and we look at the budget each year, and this is the time of year that we want to look at that. So last episode, we talked about the process and the concept of the budget. I think today we want to talk a little bit more about some of the actual numbers, some of the priorities, and some of the specific things that are in that budget to give people a better understanding of, what is our government spending money on?
Yes. For everybody out there that thinks that this is just simply a political process, it actually isn't. It actually is really a budget process. And it could be just like the simple budget process that you go through in your home is, should we spend money on this? Should we spend money on that? And obviously, all of us as taxpayers, we should be engaged in this process. And as well, the stock market has reactions to some of these priorities. And so that's why we're going to cover some of the key fiscal priorities from the executive branch that are in this budget this year.
Yes, and we're not here to, just a quick disclaimer, we're not here to judge one way or the other or get too political or discuss what we think is good money spent or not, but really just discuss the numbers and point out where things are going and maybe some of the reasoning as to why.
Exactly. It is one of those things where we want you to have enough knowledge so that you're not fearful about the process going on. As we said before, though there might be some sort of government shutdown, the government's not going away, we'll still be protected, and they're not going to let our country just fall into a sinkhole. So Let's talk a little bit about some of these priorities.
Yeah, priority number 1, we're looking at reducing non-defense discretionary spending. So we did actually see an increase in defense spending, so we'll talk more about that, but the reduction piece of it was the non-defense discretionary spending. So trying to cut down on some of that miscellaneous spending on areas like education, housing, medical research, environmental protection, some of those things that are included in that piece of the budget.
Now, the word discretionary is, part of every person's personal budget where, you have things that you have to spend money on. You got to spend money on your heat, where you live. There's things that are fixed costs that just to survive. Now, when we heard what we just talked about as discretionary, people might really kick at that saying, education, housing, medical research, these are all like essential items.
And this is not us coming up with this category, by the way.
We're not coming up with this category.
This is what the government puts in this category.
Exactly. It's not our rules. It is part of the government. But people need to understand that, yes, this is something that is a part of our program. And unfortunately, defense spending is non-discretionary. It is something that we have to have because we have a pretty evil world out there, and people like to take advantage around the world of America's wealth, and as well, we have to have a defense for that. So.
Absolutely. And at least the last piece in the non-defense spending, we were looking at cuts in this budget that's calling for about $163 billion in reductions in that non-discretionary category. But to your point, an increase was actually included for defense spending and homeland security spending. So we saw a priority of boosting funding for defense, border security, and related national security programs. And the administration is requesting higher funding for customs and border protection and enforcement efforts. So that's where some of that money went.
Some of this is related to, in a politicized nature, the fentanyl trade in the United States, and where it comes from and all of that. And anybody who's paid attention to the news knows that we've had some interactions with the Venezuelan drug cartels and some other things happening there. So whether this is something that actually would limit fentanyl, truthfully, I don't it's not my opinion whether that would work or not, but it's part of their budget. I do think that, it's part of the source of the fentanyl trade in the United States is not something that the military can do. There's sort of a part of our culture, without getting into too much of it, that needs a little bit more entertainment or a little bit more escapism, and drugs and alcohol can be an escape for people that are downtrodden or are choosing a path where they don't want to have reality. So I don't know that the military spending on that's going to reduce some of that fentanyl trade. If it does reduce it, that could be a very helpful thing. But we do have an epidemic of fentanyl. I'm not sure that military is the way. That's just my opinion. But we're not making the budget here. So
right. That is just some of the justification behind
exactly.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
But a third priority we have is reorganization and cuts to government agencies and programs. So I'm sure any of you listening probably have a little bit of familiarity with this. We saw a lot of talks earlier this year on this particular component of the budget. So lots of restructuring, the Department of Health, Human Services, combining and merging multiple agencies under a new administration for Healthy America, and reducing workforce agencies like the CDC, NIH, the FDA, trying to essentially, the goal there to make these agencies more efficient, try to cut down on some waste spending, some things that maybe were allocated in the wrong places.
Absolutely. And I don't think there's a single in tune American that thinks our government spends their money wisely. You're not going to find anybody really that says that. The truth is that in a most recent bill that passed through one of the subcommittees in dealing with just in general about health care, it came out of the Republican committee, but they put a little thing in there that is protecting Bayer from their lawsuit on all of these weed killers that they use that cause cancer. And they put a little item in the bill that is going to protect them from any of these billions of dollars worth of lawsuits that are out there. And now what's happening is internally within the current administration is that there's a internal war going on because the Make America Healthy Again is having a fight with the others that are trying to protect one of their big supporters, Bayer. So it's interesting. So that's where the politics gets involved. Should Bayer get some sort of exemption for causing cancer in all those people's lives and the people's loss? That's not for me to decide, but the voters should decide as to whether or not Bayer gets that off. But this is the kind of thing that happens inside of the bill process, where all of a sudden they start throwing in a few little things here and there, and as we go through and reorganizing and restructuring these agencies, we've seen things like FEMA, where people were cut out of the FEMA process, and then we had the flood down in Texas, partly, obviously natural disaster, but there was no warnings in place because the FEMA employees weren't there anymore because they were gone. So there was no warning. So some of this stuff that we're seeing may not actually come to fruition, even though they were recommended by DOJ to do it. So let's talk a little bit about the freezing and the rescinding unspent agency funds.
Yeah, so this administration is another one of their priorities. They're pursuing legal and regulatory-based tools to freeze or rescind various agencies as a way to exert executive control over spending. So, if there's money that has not been spent throughout the year, trying to essentially claw some of those funds back, by freezing these different agencies.
And of course, there's a lot of court hearings going on about that as to whether or not the executive branch has legal authority to do this. We're seeing it even play out for the Fed meeting tomorrow, where the current executive branch is trying to remove one of the Fed governors. Now, again, it doesn't really have anything to do with the budget process, but it is an ongoing legal challenge to some of the process that we're seeing, because the Congress does constitutionally have the power of the purse strings. So we'll see how that all plays out in court. But one of the things they're doing right now is they're cutting foreign aid. There's a push to reduce what we are giving and what we are using in our overseas and foreign aid funding. And some of the funds approved by Congress have been frozen or proposed to be rescinded by the current administration, even though the law says that those people are supposed to get their money. So we'll see how that all plays out in court. The next one is the fiscal discipline. Debt and deficit concerns that, America as a government, we're in debt. Big time.
We are. And we talked about it a little bit in the last episode. There's a goal here to try to not only reduce spending, but slow down the increase of spending as well, because it's a little bit easier said than done to just actually spend less. That's a bigger problem for the government. But if they can just simply slow down, just a lot like inflation, if they can just simply slow down the rate at which we're increasing spending, that's a little bit of a win in of itself. And so there's negotiations for some spending caps, roughly around 1% growth of the discretionary spending, to help reflect some of those concerns about the ever increasing debt ceiling and the amount of debt our country's in, and the things like the interest cost that it comes with a debt that size.
Yeah. Exactly. When you start looking at the domestic programs that we have right now, there is definitely a priority shift. And some of the shift of priorities with the current administration is that they want to increase the funding for the homeland security, border enforcement, defense, while deprioritizing or deeply cut back many domestic and non-defense programs. Now, again, we do want to defend our country. There's no doubt about it. But the current situation is that there's been such an emphasis that there are those parts of our government, including people that are members of the same party of the executive branch, who see this as a very dangerous thing to do, where we're going to leave so many people basically out in the cold with some of the cuts that have taken place. And it's not so much considered to be inhumane as much as not the right thing to do. Particularly for their constituents if they want to get reelected again.
Yeah, it's just this constant battle and people have different opinions and different points of view on things, but it's this constant battle of, well, what's considered a waste or an overspend, and what is more essential, and what is something that has maybe a larger adverse effect by reducing its spending or cutting that program than actually just simply, biting the bullet and spending the money on that program, and spending a little more on the deficit, but having these programs that are important to the social or economic aspect of our country.
Yeah, and particularly in the economic side. So give an example. You don't have to agree whether you like wind farms or not like wind farms, but this is a great instance here on the East Coast of certain wind farms that have been budgeted and allocated legally by the Congress to finish some of these wind projects. But the executive branch has pulled that funding and canceled it. Now, what's interesting about that is even in the state of Texas, the wind farms and the solar production have really reduced their dependency on traditional forms of energy production. And consumption's not going down, by the way. Consumption's going up. Whether it's just simply an opinion that they think it's a waste of money, or they think they're ugly, or they think solar panels are worthless, blah, blah, blah. What's happening, though, is the facts are saying that this has actually had a very positive impact on the grid in the United States. So it's interesting to kind of watch this go through the process. What's also interesting, and should keep note of this, is that there are several members that are leadership members in the party that is in control of the executive branch right now, members of their own party in the executive branch that really need some support to keep the solar construction industry going, as well as wind farms, because it is having a positive impact in their state, not just on the grid nationally. And I read an article just over the weekend, and I verified it several times, that that particular area, this alternative energy, has added almost 35 to 40% power to our grid, which with not really that much cost in the sense of what it's costing the consumer.
Right.
So this is an interesting dynamic to watch happening, in our society. It's not just about the environment. It's actually something that provides for us. So I think education is a big part of it too. Public health research, environment programs are being scaled back. These are things that we should look at as to what their priorities are.
Yeah, so we just have a visual representation of a lot of the stuff we just discussed. So we have things like the priorities around fiscal discipline and deficit control, foreign aid reductions and freezes. There was some of the efficiency drive through DOGE, environmental protection programs being cut, reorganization of the HHS and agency consolidations, medical research, NIH, CDC, FDA, there were some cuts there. We had border enforcement and customs funding, so increase in some of that defense spending, then homeland security spending that we were talking about earlier, education and housing programs, some cuts to those, and then reductions to non-defense spending. So as you can see here, there's a lot of these moving parts. Some things increase, some things decrease, and at the end of the day, these decisions are put through with some of the recent budget bill that we were talking about, and it's a concession of some things that some people think maybe are more important than others and others don't, and you're kind of seeing some of that laid out into where this money's being allocated in this budget.
And also too, what I've seen happen here is a little bit unique. I'm watching as the federal government has, like on the vaccine end of it, decided that they're going to pull vaccine endorsements and these things of that nature. But now we're watching some of these states pick that up and take it and say, hey, as far as vaccines go, our state we're going to put it out there, for you to be able to get those vaccines. And we're going to make sure that the insurers pay for them. So it is interesting to watch the states come into play here and say, no, we're going to do this to take care of our people. So as we move forward here on this,
and that is actually one last thought on that too. Yeah. That is kind of what's and that is what's being brought about with a lot of this budget. With a lot of for example, I'll even mention the big one I think a lot of people have strong opinions on were some of the Medicaid cuts as part of this budget and the healthcare expenses there. A lot of that is not necessarily cuts on Medicaid as a whole, but cuts on the portion that the federal government is supplying to states.
Correct.
And it is kind of putting it more on their shoulders. So now some states, I think maybe the nice thing about that is it does allow states to kind of do more of their own funding for those sorts of things and provide how much they want to actually give out to their citizens. But at the same time, there are some states that need much more assistance than others. And that's where I think there's that, it's this weighing both sides of the coin of how much cut is too much, where you're affecting people's medical needs and their livelihood, but, how much actually just, puts it back on the onus of the states and, just less kind of handout from the government.
Correct. And I think that, they're trying to put in place this rule of a certain number of hours work per week for those that are able-bodied enough to do it. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think most Americans would agree and say, hey, for those who are able to work, we should be able to find a job for them and all of that. It's all nice to talk about that, but let's kind of go through history a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about where we came from as a country. So, as we started in our country, yes, there were other people that were here. They were called Native Americans or Indians. And we came in, we took over their territory, and we basically conquered the American Indians that were here, and we took over the country. So that's what happened. We were immigrants. We came to America, and, we went out west, we went everywhere, and we conquered the people that were living here. That's what happened. That's reality. Now, on those notes, communities used to take care of each other. Those small communities that started in, Virginia, North Carolina, and Massachusetts and Connecticut, these little villages, they all took care of each other as best as they could, went through winters and they shared food and they did all these things. Then, as they formed a government, you don't have to watch Hamilton to know this, but Hamilton's actually, I would encourage everybody to watch Hamilton. It's a great way to look at history. But you begin to see the government expand into this role where now all of a sudden the government is the one that is responsible for, the quality of life issues.
Right.
All of a sudden we've come together as a country and said, these are quality of life issues. And then we have, the advance of other countries that want to take what we have. They would love to take over America. They would love to take our wealth and take everything we have, and they just would love to have our country. Well, you have to have a defense to take care to make sure that somebody doesn't do that.
Sure.
Reality is that we've grown and we've changed, and now it's time for our country to actually figure out what are our real priorities. And so let's talk a little bit about what the Congress's priorities are. And I say this giving you an example of Senator Josh Hawley. In his particular state, he has over 60% of his people that are in his state are affected adversely by these Medicaid cuts. And he's one of the people who are saying, look, it can't stay this way because I'm going to have too many people that are going to get hurt by it.
Right.
And he's a Republican, and he's saying what is affecting his people. So we know that it's out there. So let's talk a little bit about priorities.
Yeah, so these are drawn from different congressional action, public statements, committee requests, but different parties had different emphases, like we were talking about. And, so some of these reflect negotiations and a blend of different interests. But one of the big priorities is the appropriations and congressionally directed spending. Congress, especially the Senate, they're continuing to accept requests from senators for projects important to the states and local areas. So things like infrastructure, healthcare, education, via the CDC. So that's a big...
The CDS, yeah.
Or CDS, sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. So we're looking at a priority there around some of, local spending within different states.
And again, this is where the Congress has done the CDS. They've done their congressionally direct spending, and the executive branch has come in and said, we're going to take that away. So bills that have already been passed and already passed law and became law, spending revenue law, the executive branch is trying to take it back. So that fight's still going to be going on in court. I don't think Congress really wants to abdicate their constitutional responsibility. So
right.
I'm kind of hopeful that the people that really read the Constitution understand. The next one is the new top line discretionary spending limits. What this really means is, where do we start at the top? It's not where we end up, it's where we start at the top. And since we have statutory caps that are in place that were part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, they're no longer binding. So Congress needs to set new top lines that really put that cap on discretionary spending. So, if you give somebody $1 billion for discretionary spending, that's very different than giving them $50 million for discretionary spending.
Definitely.
So.
Yep, and then another priority here is avoiding a government shutdown. We discussed this a little on the last episode, but just, Congress wanting to avoid that time at the end of the month, end of September here in 2025, October 1st being the start of the new fiscal year, but avoiding a shutdown because they can't come to an agreement on this bill in time. Now, there is a measure, a continuing resolution that they can pass to continue that, but avoiding a shutdown altogether is going to be key because there's some adverse effects on the economy and the market when those things happen.
Exactly. So the balancing the defense and the non-defense spending is a real tension. I mean, that is a real tension in Congress.
It is.
And it's not just the military hawks or the other people that are more socially responsible in that way. It's not just them. It's just the average American and the average Congress person, whether Democrat or Republican, are hearing the same thing at their town halls. What's happening, particularly the farmers right now, are really, really struggling with some of the loss of the goods that they were selling to Canada, China, Mexico, all these places where all of a sudden now the farmers have rotting fields of crops because they don't have workers, or they've lost their contracts and they can't, like soybeans has been a really big sale from America to China. And that's off the grid right now. And watching over the weekend, a couple farmers, they were big Republican supporters, and now they're very much questioning what did their party do to them, because now they're running out of money. Right, and the government could come in and subsidize and just give them money like that's happened in the past. But that's not really helping the economy any. Really what we're helping the economy with should be opening up markets for them. But that's my opinion. I'm not
I agree.
macroeconomist here.
The short-term fix, not a long-term fix there. So, and now also over this whole process, there's a priority for transparency and oversight over spending. I think that's something that's been talked about a lot this year in a lot of the budget reviews is wasteful spending or simply money going to places where it's unsure where it's being spent or not accounted for. So Congress is making CDS requests for more transparent, more emphasis on accountability and discretionary funds. So that way they're not lost, that there's not this mysterious money flowing.
Yeah, where did that money go? Yeah, exactly. So here in our state, Massachusetts, if you happen to be watching, you're from Massachusetts, we have even though it's a very progressive liberal state, we have actually one of the worst transparency records in all of the other 49 states as to some of the backdoor spending that goes on. And again, not being political, but it's a reality check. Yeah, we actually have a state auditor who's asking for more transparency, and actually the Massachusetts voted overwhelmingly and as a binding resolution in the last fall election that we had to say we want more transparency as citizens and watch what our state legislature does. So it's not just the federal government or not just the executive branch that's going through this. I think every state, every citizen who's paying taxes should have the ability to see, how's my money being spent? Why they're taking it out of my wallet and then they're putting it in their wallet. What are they doing with it? I want to know what they're doing with it. So
yes.
It's a real thing.
Absolutely. And then finally, the last few things, last three priorities: support for local and state level infrastructure, community projects, public safety. So like we were talking about earlier, a lot of projects being requested by senators wanting funding for these local things like roads, bridges, public safety, health, education. And Congress is recognizing that the importance of these things and having money earmarked for these local programs.
Yeah, when you have bridges that are falling apart or you have roads that are just like a third world country and you're living in a first world country, we do have infrastructure issues all across this country.
Right.
And it can't just be the federal government. It's got to be state and local governments that are involved in this process. And so, as you go through this, there's got to be some responsibility and fiscal restraint. In fact, I was thinking about this just the other day, thinking that, right now, what would be the worst possible name if you wanted to start a hair salon?
Yeah, I don't know.
Budget cuts.
Okay.
It would be a bad name. I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it. Let's talk a little bit about the priorities here in our little chart, just to kind of go through and what's happening here.
Yeah, so if we have to break these out from House versus Senate, if we're looking at some of the congressional House priorities, we have things like skepticism of large earmarks, those CDS expansions, making sure that those, again, unused or unsure, those mysterious funds are cut down on, pressure to avoid shutdowns, willingness to use leverage, pushing for cuts on the non-defense discretionary programs. So I think, overall good piece there, but again, being careful on what's they are considering non-discretionary. And then greater focus on defense spending, tighter spending limits, and fiscal restraints. So that's some of the priorities on the House side, but why don't you talk through some of the Senate priorities?
Yeah, I think one of the first key things is to understand what the word earmark means. When somebody says that this has been earmarked, what that means is you need to listen very closely as to how your tax dollars are getting ripped off. I mean, in the Senate, they want transparency and accountability in spending. That's what they want. And this is really driven by a bipartisan group that's in the Senate, which I'm rooting for it. I think that would be awesome for our country to be able to really engage in that process and then elect people that the majority of America says this is where we want to spend our money. This is what we want to do. Right. The emphasis is on bipartisan cooperation to avoid a shutdown. The Senate tends to be more collegial and tends to be a little bit more like willing to work to get things out. And again, there's not so many cats to wrangle in the Senate as compared to the Congress, The infrastructure and education and public safety investments is a really, really big deal for the Senate. And again, in a Senate like we have two senators here in our state, Massachusetts, these senators are representing their states and they are trying to make it an impact for federal money that can be used in their state. So this is a good thing. They're also supporting these local projects that are very important. This is where the, congressionally direct spending earmarks could be spent. Unfortunately, most earmarks have been more for political things, political gains, political things that they do for people that are already in the Senate or in the House and is benefiting a certain group of people rather than like benefiting the whole country. However, if you go through you're driving through the East Coast and you get through New York fine on the roads, and then you get down to New Jersey and the roads are terrible and you can't get to the other side of New Jersey, then that's a problem.
It is.
Especially if you're on federal roads. Right? Federal highways. So we also want to have a balance of defense spending as well as non-defense discretionary. So that way needs can be met, because even in a personal budget, you can have a fixed spending, but if you're off balance as to like we're just saving up money for a vacation, and you're in your house in the winter and you're at 60 degrees with 3 sweaters on, is that vacation really worth it?
Right.
And your children are going without food. Mama, food, please. Anyway, I think these are things that the Senate is really keen on. And again, it's a smaller number of people, but they're more focused on their states. So this has been a good overview. I hope that all of you out there really understand what we're trying to do here is to give you the process, whose the roles are. You don't have to politically agree or disagree with anything that we're saying because these are just the processes. This is what we go through. And if you have concerns about the process, then contact your local congressperson. Send emails to your Senate, or call them, talk to them. And what people fail to realize is that your phone call, your letter, your email actually does have an impact. And having visited in D.C. with different members of Congress and as well as senators, particularly this year, I see how a voice and voices can have an impact, particularly when they know that people are saying what they want to see done. That's the important part.
Right. Yeah. I think my last thought is I just think that's a key point. And I think being able to continue to discuss these issues and just better understand them. That's the goal of today's podcast, of today's episode, is hopefully making everyone out there not just hear maybe some of the sometimes biased talking points that some of the media outlets, like to discuss over and over again every day, but rather, what are the actual components of both sides that are going on here? What's this process look like? How do they come to these decisions? And, maybe better understand where the money's going and some of the reasons, at least, why it's going in these areas.
And you have to speak up. And again, I'll use like a family. So you bring a family together and a family says, the kids are all like, I want to go to Walt Disney World. I want to do Walt Disney World. And they're old enough to kind of understand the concept of money and all that. So, you sit down as a family and you say to them, well, look, if we want to go to Walt Disney World, it's going to cost this. So there are certain things we're going to not be able to do. So, that pair of Nike basketball shoes that you want for $300, not sure we could do that. We might have to take a different brand there. So even in a family, you have to have these conversations. Well, if we have them there, we're going to have them in our larger structure too.
Right.
So we need to be a part of the process. So anybody that's listening to this and watching this, please contact your congresspeople, express what your feelings are about it. And if you don't like something, you talk about it. But I always give something as a suggestion. I find that people who just complain and don't offer a solution, or at least offer an idea, they're not really a part of the equation. They're just complaining about something. So, give a positive. You want to cut off solar and this. Well, what else can we do? Let's think about what else we do. Do you want to go and do more nuclear stuff? And I'm not talking about nuclear options like, wiping out people. I'm talking about, nuclear power is on the rise.
Right, yeah.
But we all have to be pretty blunt about this. We all want more technology. We all want, AI to be this great thing. We all want all this stuff. But, to run AI, you need a lot of power.
You do.
You need a lot of, and more power than we actually have in our grid today.
Right.
So we have to find alternative sources of energy. And if you don't want to go wind and solar, which have been actually helping our grid, then you're going to have to go nuclear, because you can't just keep building coal plants. That's not going to work.
Right.
So we have to come together and work on this. Now, I don't know what budgeting is like in your family. Do you guys have your meetings now and then?
We do. Yeah.
And of course, Charlie's a little young for this.
Yeah. She wants to increase the dessert budget, but no, she's we have conversations regularly, usually at least about once a month, where we discuss what was spent, what was saved, and that's the I think for a personal level, that's something I always recommend to any of my clients is build that budget and actually just focus on your savings, because then once you know your money's allocated toward the things you need and you're saving a proper amount, the discretionary stuff doesn't matter so much. Now,
exactly.
Federal budgets maybe aren't quite that simple, but on a personal level, it can make things
because you got 380 million people to deal with, and their representatives that come in. So we're glad that you listened to this today. We want you to be considerate to yourself, be patient as the Congress goes through its process, and as the courts go through their process and determine the executive branch's responsibility in some of these areas and where they actually have gone over the law or are supporting the laws that are in place. So please just be patient as this all works through. But if you have questions, you can feel free to call us. So just remember, live today for the tomorrow that's in your heart.
Because you'll never have more time to invest for tomorrow than you do today.
Thank you for listening.
Bread and butter.